For nearly 2 decades, the Electronic Entertainment Expo, or E3, in Los Angeles, was the singular axis upon which the gaming industry turned. It was a battleground where the three platform holders, Nintendo, Sony, and Microsoft, competed for the attention of the assembled global press. The format was rigid, a massive stage presentation followed by days of floor interviews. During this era, journalists held significant leverage. Executives like Shigeru Miyamoto and Reggie Fils-Aimé were physically present and accessible. In the scrum of the show floor or the pressure of a roundtable interview, journalists could corner these executives. They could ask unscripted questions about declining sales, hardware failures, for example, the Virtual Boy or the slow start of the 3DS, or competitive threats. The live press conference was a high-risk, high-reward format. While a successful show could define a generation, for example, the Wii reveal in 2006, a failure was catastrophic and immutable. For example, there was the Wii music debacle from 2008. A disastrous live demonstration of Wii music featuring Shigeru Miyamoto miming instruments was universally mocked by the press, damaging the game's commercial prospects before it launched. You also had the 3DS confusion in 2010. When the Nintendo 3DS was unveiled, the press struggled to convey the glasses-free 3D effect to their readers, leading to confusion about whether the device was a new console or just a DS iteration. There was also the issue of children under 7 potentially getting permanent eye damage when viewing the 3D effect. Concerning another debacle from 2010, Nintendo journalist Lucas M. Thomas writes, "The Wii remote wasn't working. He swung his arm to the left, but the sword went right. He tried a vertical slice, but it came out as a diagonal. This happened over and over again throughout a gameplay demo that struggled across each of its 15 painful minutes. By the time it was blessedly finally over, I think secondhand embarrassment had settled over the entire audience." But not Satoru Iwata. He wasn't embarrassed. He was inspired. It was E3 again. E3 2010 this time, 6 years after the triumph of the 2004 showing, and several years deep into the spectacularly successful life cycle of the Wii. Hundreds of millions of consoles, games, and motion-sensing controllers had been sold to a greatly expanded gaming audience, and all had led up to this moment, the full, live gameplay showcase of The Legend of Zelda: Skyward Sword, the most advanced, most anticipated, most hyped-up adventure of that entire hardware generation. And it bombed. It was terrible. It's been over 13 years since it happened as I'm writing this, and I honestly had to force myself to go back and rewatch the whole thing to refresh my memory. Even worse, it wasn't Mr. Iwata himself who was fighting against the malfunctioning controls. It was Shigeru Miyamoto, standing on stage alongside NOA's Bill Trinan, who was there to translate Mr. Miyamoto's comments as he played. You could tell things had really gone off the rails toward the end when Bill gave up trying to translate and just started to apologize. "There must be a lot of interference in here today. Who's using wireless out there? This all went really well in rehearsal, I promise." And that was the opening segment of that year's show. Mr. Iwata was waiting backstage, watching it all blow up, and steeling himself for his own segment since he had to walk out on the same stage later on. As he did, I have to imagine he was thinking, there must be a better way, and the gears of his endless creative mind began to move once more. These incidents highlighted the inefficiency of the medium in the eyes of Nintendo. They were relying on intermediaries to explain complex, experiential concepts to the consumer, and those intermediaries often failed or focused on the wrong details. Satoru Iwata Nintendo's president, grew increasingly frustrated with this noise. He recognized that the filter of the press was distorting Nintendo's message. This is all from their perspective, how they might frame the issue. Falsely. Satoru Iwata was unique among CEOs. A former programmer, he thought in terms of systems and efficiency. He viewed the traditional PR model as a lossy compression algorithm. When he spoke to a journalist, and that journalist wrote an article, and a fan read that article, data was lost at each step. Iwata wanted a lossless connection. In his Iwata Asks series, initiated around 2006, Iwata began to experiment with bypassing the press entirely. By interviewing his own developers, he proved that Nintendo could generate high-quality, engaging content that fans would consume directly. This was the proof of concept for what would become the Nintendo Direct, a mechanism to deliver information directly to you without the editorial bias or skepticism of a third-party journalist. Why let a journalist filter the message when you can broadcast a high-production commercial directly to the fans? This killed the adversarial interview. This is not a neutral business strategy. It's anti-accountability. A great contemporary artifact here is GameSpot's 2008 PressSpotting Roundup. It bluntly calls journalists gatekeepers and describes how consensus among the specialist press formed quickly, and it explicitly frames Nintendo as increasingly treating the hardcore press as less central to its strategy. Just because Nintendo can refuse interviews doesn't make it right. Journalists not being entitled to access is a dodge. Journalists serve the public interest and protect consumers. As the Washington Post famously says, democracy dies in darkness. A major corporation that influences millions of consumers, especially children, like Nintendo, should answer to independent scrutiny, not just broadcast, polished marketing. However, in 2011, Nintendo initiated a paradigm shift with the launch of Nintendo Direct. The name itself, derived from the Japanese concept of Chokusetsu, direct, signaled the strategic intent to establish a pipeline of information that flowed from the corporate source to the end user without distortion. This was a radical departure from industry norms. In 2011, YouTube was still maturing as a platform for corporate communication, and live streaming was in its infancy. Most companies used these platforms for archiving commercials. Nintendo used them to broadcast global press conferences directly to the consumer's bedroom. Over the last decade, Nintendo has conditioned its audience to distrust external sources. The phrase, "wait for the direct," has become a mantra in the Nintendo community. This conditioning effectively devalues independent journalism. If a journalist reports a rumor, the community often attacks the journalist for lying or ruining the surprise, acting as unpaid defenders of Nintendo's secrecy. These types of fans even existed before the Nintendo Direct was implemented. David Sheff wrote, "The more Nintendo became a force in the lives of millions of kids, the more concerned parents and educators became. The worries were exacerbated by the degree of devotion kids seemed to have for the games and for Nintendo's culture. It was as if America's kids had joined a cult and were under the spell of a cartoon character who did the bidding of a hidden Japanese lord. Some kids are out of control Nintendo zombies, as Oprah Winfrey dubbed them on her television talk show. The company's arguments did little to stem the growing concern about a generation of vidiots, hypnotized kids who blindly follow a Pied Piper in the form of Super Mario. Other companies are now following in their footsteps. For example, Sony's official announcement introducing State of Play frames it as a recurring video program for announcements. And Business Insider explicitly described State of Play as Nintendo style and said it mimics Nintendo Direct, noting Nintendo has used Directs since 2011. Similar reporting exists for Xbox. The most definitive break from traditional media structures occurred in 2013. On April 25th, 2013, Nintendo announced it would skip the traditional E3 press conference in favor of smaller, directed events. The press reaction was one of shock and perceived irrelevance. By refusing to hold a large-scale conference, Nintendo denied the media the spectacle they relied on for page views and the access they relied on for scoops. Analysts have described this move as Nintendo firing the press. Journalists were no longer the first to see the new Super Smash Bros. Or Mario Kart. They saw it at the exact same second as the fans on Twitter and Reddit. Because there was no post-show scrum or immediate Q&A, journalists could not immediately counter the Nintendo narrative with skeptical questions. The Direct stood as the definitive record of the event.
All right, Brian, what's your first Nintendo hot take?
This is definitely nostalgia speaking, but the best Nintendo Direct will never be as good as the best Nintendo E3 live show. It just never will.
Okay.
Yeah.
To fully appreciate Nintendo's secrecy, one could compare it to Microsoft's approach. Phil Spencer regularly participated in long-form, unscripted interviews with various outlets, including those that have been critical of Xbox. He admits failures, for example, the Redfall launch, and discusses industry challenges openly. This builds a brand based on transparency and gamer-first relatability. By contrast, Furukawa and Miyamoto operate as distant figureheads. They do not appear on podcasts to discuss their failures. They appear in scripted directs to announce their successes. Nintendo's brand is built on magic and polish, which requires the concealment of the messy human element of business. Nintendo's tight-lock approach is also visible in how they handle technical questions. Reporting around the Switch 2 and Joy-Con Drift describes Nintendo being vague about the stick mechanism even when directly asked, and refusing to get specific. We'll look at the issue of Joy-Con Drift in a future video.